Dear students, welcome to International Innovation Management 2, to the installment 3. And you remember we talked last week in the last installment about that customers are really good sources for innovation. That once we learn about their needs, once we learn about their wants, we have great opportunities to innovate. But let us ask a question in this installment: whose needs? Whose needs do we actually look at? And of course, there's different customer segments. For instance, you have established customers versus underserviced niche. If we have this distinction, we'll talk about disruptive innovation. If we distinguish between developed economy customers versus emerging economy customers, well, we talk about resource-constrained customers and frugal innovation at the end of the day. So this is basically the two blocks of content that we talk about in this screencast. And let us go right into disruptive innovation. And disruptive innovation comes from, originates from Clayton Christensen. And you remember Clayton Christensen last week, last installment, he introduced us to his idea of jobs to be done. So Clayton Christensen, who passed away earlier this year, basically gave rise to a couple of very interesting topics and constructs, concepts in innovation and innovation management in particular. Now let's have a look at this. This is a sailing ship. This is the Thomas D. Lawson. It's the largest sailing ship ever built for freight transport. It was built in 1902. If you were a seaman, you would probably realize that it is a 7-masted schooner and it has a steel hull, so no wood, but it's made out of steel. And it was built actually for trans-Pacific trade, but used for coal and oil transportation in the east coast of the US. It was named after a billionaire in Boston, or was he only a millionaire? I don't know. So Thomas D. Lawson was this guy. And the ship only lived for 5 years. It was destroyed in a storm in 1907. So the Thomas D. Lawson was designed as a sailing ship, and it was designed to compete with steamships. Well, a bit looks like a dinosaur, like out of its time type of ship. It had a couple of design glitches, failures. The hull submerged too deeply to access standard harbors, so it could only enter the harbor with reduced capacity. Not very good for economic reasons once you built a ship for freight transport. For the crew, it was very, very comfortable. It had steam heating, it had electric wrenches. I think it could be sailed with only a crew of, I don't know, 10, 12, 13 men. So a very tiny crew, because it was largely supported by electric wrenches. Very comfortable for the crew. Now, the question is was this the high time of sailing ship building sailing ships? I don't really think so. There was already the time of the steamship, and this was basically the last fight of the sailing ship industry. Let's look at the steamship. Let's look at the steamboat technology as a disruption here. And the interesting thing is, if you asked in the late 19th century, if you asked customers, do you want steamships? They did not want steamships for transatlantic, trans-Pacific trade. These ships were considered too unreliable because just imagine you had the breakdown of the steam engine in the middle of the Atlantic, in the middle of the Pacific, then you're kind of lost there. So unreliable wasn't really something that they would. In early phases of the development, the steamships were completely inferior to sailing ships. In terms of cost per mile, they had, they had the fuel. They were slower, and the reliability was smaller, was lower. So nothing that the sailing ships would have to worry about if you look at sailing ship for transatlantic, trans-Pacific trade. However, there are advantages of the steamboat technology in a certain niche, in a tiny niche. And in a tiny niche where sailing ships, sailing boats were always at a disadvantage, so to say, as river boats. So customers had a completely different demands and requirements. So it was important for a riverboat that you could transport independent of wind and independent of the flow direction of the stream. So very important plus that the steamboats had there. Reliability was not so much an issue because, if the steam engine broke down in the middle of the River Rhine, you pulled over to the next bank of the river, get to the next village, get the locksmith, the smith, etc. to fix the boat, and there you were in business again. So reliability wasn't an issue there. So as a result, the steamboat technology started its success in a tiny niche that was completely overlooked by the incumbent sailing boat technology. So the technology of the steamship matured in a niche that it finally challenged the conventional technology. And the conventional technology, of course, was the sailing boat or the sailing ship technology. Now, this is one example, one textbook example, if you like, of disruptive innovation. And disruptive innovation can be, as I said, is coined by Clayton Christensen, and it refers to a process in which the products and service or technologies are initially set in a very simple application at the bottom of the market, where you have customers who do not want to pay a lot, who have completely different needs, etc. So typically customers who are not serviced by the current technology that is already there. And then these products and services move up the markets until they challenge and displace the established products or service. So that is, and why do companies do not realize that? Because sometimes the established companies in established technologies are so successful in looking into the demands and needs of their current customers that they overlook the niches that are there, the customers who are actually not met. So this is the definition of disruptive innovation. You have a technology that starts with in a niche and that moves up and challenges the market. Not everything that you read in a newspaper, in the business press, is disruptive. Disruptive, the term is, there's an inflation of disruptive things around, and we have to make clear as innovation scholars that disruptive innovation is something very narrowly defined by Clayton Christensen. And there's a paper, and we put this paper on Elias for you. Christensen, Rayner, and MacDonald and Larson in 2016 say that disruptive innovation does not necessarily apply to every industry, where newcomers, where startups, etc., challenge the incumbents. Disruption specifically refers to what happens when the incumbents are too focused on pleasing their most profitable customers. And when they do that, and they simultaneously neglect and misjudge the needs of other segments. And when these segments basically are the nucleus of a development that finally challenges the current industry and technology. So disruption happens when consumers, or when newcomers, having already conquered the customers that incumbents are neglecting, basically come out of their niche and begin to conquer the high margin customers too. So this is basically what you see. Disruption can be low end and new market. So low end is basically disruptors come to the market with an offer that is tailored to overserved customers already, or to customers who are, and new to market disruptors are address underserved or not served customers. So there's this kind of distinction. So if you have customers, say, that are fed up with the overwhelming functionality of certain products, of certain software products, for instance, and disruptors come in and address the needs of these overserved customers, that could lead to low-end disruption. New market disruptors could be something who is not yet served. For instance, the steamships on the rivers. Okay, so if you look at it strictly, and if you go through the paper, they make a convincing case that Uber, despite all the tabloid headlines, is not disrupting the taxi business in the Clayton Christensen sense of the word. Disruption is a process, not a single moment or an isolated product introduction. So incumbents have to choose their battles wisely. That is really, really important. That is basically from the point of view of the incumbent. What do? You know that disruption can happen. So you have to choose your battle wisely. You have to address the newcomer who has the potential to disrupt the market wisely. But the problem is not every entrant has the potential of disrupting the industry. So you have to understand what disruption is, and you have to fight the real disruptors, identify them, and make offers that take away the opportunity of these disruptors to develop and grow in the niche or in their tiny markets. Okay, that is about disruptive innovation. So the needs of the customers who are already there versus the needs of the customers who are not served, underserved, overserved, etc. And I said there's another point that I want to make in this screencast is innovation for resource-constrained customers. So the customers in the developed economies versus the customers in developing economies that we typically think are resource-constrained. So innovation for resource-constrained customers are important because in emerging economies, the new middle class of consumers still have little excess income compared to Western consumers. It is important to see that this is not a reason to neglect emerging economies. And the problem also is that these customers typically suffer from additional problems, from additional constraints, such as poor public and private infrastructure, poor service availability, etc. So firms start developing market-specific solutions that are characterized by high value and low cost. That's the response to that. Product and service innovation aimed at resource-constrained customers in emerging market is really important, is really an issue here. And there's with managers of Western firms, and maybe I'm grossly simplifying, there's still some myths about consumers at what one can also call the bottom of the pyramid. So the bottom of the wealth pyramid, if you like. That poor customers have no purchasing power and do not represent a viable market. Well, yeah, you would say, of course, they have a low income. That is true. But if you look at the sheer size of the market, meaning the number of the people, this is what makes the market really interesting. So the challenge here is to offer low cost, low margin, but high quality goods and services for, say, 4 billion people. So that's quite a market size. So it's a myth that the poor have no purchasing power, and so we should not look at these markets. I mean, we're over this, obviously. The poor are not brand conscious. Well, no, they are brand conscious, and they have a high degree of brand consciousness. A very good indicator for that is talk to people from Henkel, talk to people from Procter & Gamble, talk to people from Johnson & Johnson, etc. And they will tell you, and all the fashion brands, etc. They will tell you, of course, poor have high brand consciousness. So it's not that branding is not an issue, that you cannot roll out, extend your brand to customers at the bottom of the pyramid. And there's the myth that poor or bottom of the pyramid customers, BOP, bottom of the pyramid, are hard to reach. Well, yeah, if you believe that a large fraction of these people live in the countryside, well, that may be the case, but if you turn that argument around, you would certainly see that a large fraction of people in developing countries or developing economies live in urban areas. So there is 400 cities around with more than 1 million inhabitants. 23 cities have more than 10 million inhabitants. About 40% of those can be considered at the bottom of the pyramid. So this is a high agglomeration of customers. So what you have to do is basically you have to think about novel ways about logistics, distribution, etc. to address these people in the urban areas, but also to address people in the rural areas. And of course, one of the most incredible myths, and the myths are from Tit and Besant on page 204, so you can read it up if you want. Poor are unable to use or not interested in advanced technology. I mean, this is so ridiculous. The experience shows that this is outright wrong. We don't have to talk about this, actually. But it's still there. People sometimes try to argue around that, but it's not true. And so there is a potential market, and if you are a company, if you are a multinational, excuse me, from emerging economies, or you are a multinational from developed economies, well, maybe the market of resource-constrained customers is something for you. And in this context, we have a lot of terminology going back and forth, describing these kind of innovations for resource-constrained customers. Cost innovation, good enough innovation, frugal innovation, resource-constrained innovation, tickle-up innovation, and resource innovation. If we look at the Chesky et al. Paper, 2014, they distinguish cost innovation, good enough innovation, frugal innovation, and finally reverse innovation. And reverse innovation, we don't go into that, but reverse innovation is actually a nice thing. Is once you innovate for resource-constrained customers, it may be the case that this innovation basically comes back to the developed economies and find niches or maybe even larger markets there. This happens as well. So cost innovation. If we briefly describe cost innovation, it's the same functionality at lower cost. So cost innovation are solutions that offer the similar functionality to Western or developed economy products at lower cost for resource-constrained customers. Cost innovation is, so to say, not a new phenomenon. A good example is, for instance, Huawei, from an emerging economy from China that offers top smartphones which are significantly cheaper than the iPhones, etc., of Western competitors. And maybe you call even Samsung from Korea a Western or developed economy competitor. So if you look at the slides and you think Western is not the correct term, well, you could think not only Western, but replace Western by developed economy, and then maybe that's a better terminology. So what can you do as an innovator to achieve cost innovation? You could reduce the size of the product to be more affordable for resource-constrained customers. There's a good example of Henko, Persil, a detergent, and consumers in, I guess, sub-Saharan Africa actually like this detergent, but the kilo and 1.5 kilo packs were too expensive for them as for one purchase. So Henko innovated single wash packs of detergent, and they sold like crazy. You reduce the size of the product to make it more affordable. Utilize labor cost advantages in emerging economies. Maybe even in the R&D departments, that could be particularly suitable for Chinese and Indian firms. CPMC is a Chinese harbor crane manufacturer, the interesting industry of harbor cranes. And they offer highly customized solutions for harbors, specially tailored, etc. And they can do so at the same cost as the German competitors, for instance, because they can hire about N times, and N being 4, 5, or 6, more engineers based on the wage differences than the German competitors can. So cost advantage is generated either by low labor costs, local sourcing, standardized components, and by scale. So you can approach this and learn a lot from that. Good enough innovation, another one of these types of innovation for resource-constrained customers. In short, tailored functionality at lower cost. So good enough innovations are solutions that include functionalities and features that are particularly designed for meeting the needs and wants of resource-constrained customers. And these meeting the needs and wants are, of course, beyond capital constraints. Because if it were only capital constraints, you would possibly think that a cost innovation would do. Same functionality at a lower cost. But if there's different demands, you need a tailored functionality at a lower cost, because we're talking about capital constraints of these consumers as well. So how can you do that? Well, of course you use labor cost advantages in emerging economies, also in the R&D departments. We heard that. So the same thing as generating a cost innovation. You adapt and re-engineer your products to fit to the specific requirements in the markets. So, for instance, Mettler Toledo produces scales. So scales to weigh meat, grain, etc. And they developed a basic good enough weighing scale for the Chinese market, whereas only the basic feature set of Mettler's other products. And so they sold it like crazy because, of course, it was a Swiss firm. It is a Swiss firm. It was Swiss designed. It was precise. It was reliable, etc. But it had significantly less features and was, of course, basic, cheaper, etc. Now we were talking about reverse innovation, and now this Mettler Toledo weighing scale came back to Western markets, to developed markets, and found a lot of customers there because, you know, reverse innovation. They innovated for China, but this product appealed to developed market customers as well. So good enough innovation. What do you do? I mean, you have to identify and what are the values, what features do your customers in these developing economies really value? What is important for them? And again, how do you learn about that? We talked about this in installment 2. Of course, you try to get consumer insights. You talk to consumers, you make focus groups, etc. All the qualitative methodologies, all the ethnographic stuff that you've been reading about, we've been talking about. You can use that here. So you're generating product novelty emerging from focusing on core features. And these core features can be features like ease of use, robustness, and a reduced sets of functions. So you only focus on the core features, on the core functionalities. So that's important. Now the third innovation type that we are talking about for resource-constrained customers is frugal innovation. And frugal innovation is briefly new functionality at a lower cost. So frugal innovations are innovations that are specifically developed for resource-constrained customers in emerging markets. They're also called Ghanaian innovation or Jugaad. Frugal innovation are not re-engineered innovation for resource-constrained customers like the Mettler Toledo, but they're fully developed for this specific context. A new product architecture, making, for instance, stationary products mobile. Completely new type of product design in terms of new product construction, which will help you to reach entirely new customers. The poster boy of frugal innovation is the GE Logic book. It's an ultrasound medical device with significantly fewer features than traditional devices that you typically have. And if you look at the slide, the Logic book ultrasound is on the left-hand side of the image, the white object, the white device, whereas the kind of traditional device that you have in emerging economies, hospitals, etc., practices, is the blue-white device on the right-hand side. So you already see that there is some sort of difference. And GE developed the Logic book basically from the scratch for these resource-constrained customers. So the price is about a fifth, so 20% of the traditional devices. It is smaller, lighter, it has basic functionality, no bells, none and whistles, so very basic functionality, and it's portable and it's robust, so that medical practitioners can also take it on a bike ride and go to sick people in the village, on the countryside, and they with that they take up the often lousy infrastructure that does not allow a sick or ill person to come to the practitioner. So that is a frugal innovation, and if you like, search for frugal innovations around. Use the internet to find frugal innovations, which could be a nice inspiration for you to innovate. And of course, Roland Berger, as a strategy consultant, came around and said, oh, frugal innovation is a good one, and that you can recall it more easily what it actually is. They used the term frugal and made it an abbreviation of functional, robust, user-friendly, growing, affordable, and local. So functional, the product performance doesn't have to be high-end. It can be either low-end or mid-end, but it doesn't have to be high-end. Remember the logic book. It has to be robust and maintenance-friendly. So no fragile product will make it into frugal. It has to be user-friendly in terms of maintenance, etc. Has to be easy to use. Also very important, if you have first-time users, it has to be sort of self-explanatory. It's good if the market volume is high, or it's going to be high, so you have a growing market, a large production, so that even if you have a lower margin, that you in the start of the product, that you can tap into economies of scale and increase the margin and increase the revenue that you get from that. Affordable. Products are low priced, offer good value for money. The point is good value for money. So customers want a low price, but not a cheap product in the literal sense. Products are mainly sold in emerging markets and tailored to local requirements. But as we heard, they can come back to Western economies as well. Find niches there. So how do you get frugal innovation? Well, you can simplify. You focus on value. So you avoid waste, avoid overshooting the functionality. Do not reinvent the wheel. I mean, you could say that over and over again. Do not reinvent the wheel. Adopt, adapt, reuse. Combine ideas from different areas, from different even different industries. There's this interesting example. I think it comes out of IDEO, and there was a medical device company that was trying to build a medical device including a throwaway pump. And they needed a throwaway pump, so something that is very cheap to produce, but that pumps very reliable. And so the engineers were sitting around the table thinking about how can we design a reliable throwaway pump, etc. Until somebody looked around and had a water pistol on his desk. And so they came up with a technology that is built into this plastic small boy water pistols, and they used this idea to build a reliable pump for a medical device that could be thrown away. So combine ideas from elsewhere. Think horizontally, open up the innovation process, engage more minds on the job. We'll talk about this later, and the open innovation that this calls for is part of the course Innovation Strategy in Networks that is currently running as well. Think about platforms built simple, frugal at the core, and then if you need more functionality, add modules. Think about how you can basically do this. And of course, continuous improvement, involving and learning is as important for frugal innovation as it is important for all of the innovations. So that's about disruptive innovation and frugal innovation. I'm looking forward to the next screencast. Stay tuned.